Thank you so much, Alan. I really like him, but he does like to toot his own horn. 2 weeks ago, I had gone with 3 other adults and a group of kids to CentraKids, so it's children's camp. This is either the 8th or 9th year that I have gone to children's camp, and was kind of hoping maybe that I would have aged out of this, but Peter was telling me that he's aging into children's camp. Do you see my enthusiasm? Anyway, CentraKid, the location that we go to is actually at Gardner-Webb University, which is kind of interesting and cool for me, though, 'cause that's where I did my undergrad, and so it's kind of neat to go back. And by and large, we've had really good experiences there. That location works really well for camp, except for the fact that they have been redoing completely and expanding their dining room, and because of that, they had moved all the meal times to the basement of the student center. And last year that wasn't great. This year, and even though the dining room is now ready, they weren't letting the kids in there because they're saving that for the students when that starts with the fall semester. Anyway, so they said it was supposed to be better this year. Well, it wasn't. And let me just tell you, I will judge a camp based on the food experience, because really that's my only reason for getting up in the morning. And previously, the food had been, in the scheme of things, pretty decent. Among the reasons why is because there were, for everybody, there were plenty of options. And so if you didn't like what was available in this line, there was typically something available in another line. And there would be plenty of it, and there was, I mean, it wasn't the best food you've ever had, but there was nothing to complain about. This time, there was plenty to complain about. And I won't bore you with all the details. But one of the things that was particularly a problem to me is that the food offerings that were given, it seemed to me, it didn't make sense as to why these were offered specifically at children's camp. Let me give you an example. In the line where they had like the meat and vegetables, this particular night they had barbecued chicken legs. And there's nothing wrong with a barbecue chicken leg, except I really don't like chicken legs. I like white meat, and I didn't care for chicken legs. And so, anyway, I took a pass on that. The other option, and I don't even know, this is not meat, but they had tofu. Really? What in the world is tofu anyway? I think that's that white stuff you get on your tonsils. So they had some of that there. Needless to say, there was plenty of it because no one is eating it. So, I mean, you only have to make a little bit, but like it just sits there. And so there's tofu, and then here's the vegetable option. You ready? Brussels sprouts and kale. In fact, let me be more specific. Brussels sprouts in kale. Really? Really? I can tolerate a Brussels sprout if you roast it. Barely. These were not roasted. But kale? Really? I'm still bitter at Chick-fil-A that they got rid of good coleslaw for bad kale. Kale is a garnish. It is to food what kudzu is to vines. It is not to be eaten. If you do eat it, you should stop it. There is no reason that is grown. It should be sprayed with Roundup. There is no reason. There is why it's called a superfood. I have no idea. It is just plain terrible. And so they've taken these 2 horrible items, kale and Brussels sprouts, and they said, "Ooh, these are both bad. Let's put them together and make something especially horrible. And then let's add enough pepper to it so it would make people sick. And then let's put this out here for the kiddies. And let angry people serve it." And so I'm sitting at the table with the chaperones, and I said, I don't get it. I don't get it. Like, it seems to me if you are thinking through, or if you're going to be providing meals for kids at camp, I get you want to have some more healthy options, and especially if you're on a college campus, you're going to have some healthy options because, I don't know, for people that don't shave their legs and are communists that want to eat stuff like that, that's okay. If you want to have that out there, I'm fine. But that was free. Anyway, but for kids camp, like put some hamburgers out here, some chicken nuggets, like something normal, like that you. And these kids, they've been burning calories all day long, and don't put this garbage out here. I mean, think through this. Think, all right, we are serving children. What would kids actually eat? It seems to me that somebody should have said, you know what? Let's actually think about what we're doing before we actually do it. That whole thinking before we do something, there's a novel idea, isn't it? But then again, we all get that right, don't we? I have never acted before thinking. How about you? Certainly I have never spoken before thinking. Have you? No, we never do that right, or never fail on that end. But the reality is this: we are best served when we think before we actually act. Now, we are nearing the end of a message that Jesus shared that we know as the Sermon on the Mount, where he has been unpacking this notion of kingdom, where he is our king, and he is speaking to those that are his part of his domain, that are his followers, that are kingdom citizens. And he is establishing what kingdom norms are like. And one of the things that's going to happen for those that are following Jesus as their king, until they are in his physical kingdom, we are still here. And because of that, we are going to find ourselves following him, going against the drift of culture. And we're going to be seeing things, and we're going to be making assessments, and we are going to be evaluating things where Jesus is saying one thing and our culture is saying to do another. Jesus is going to be saying this is in bounds, and our culture is going to be saying that's out of bounds. Our culture is going to be saying this is okay, and our king is going to be saying that that's not okay. And consequently, we are going to have to be making judgments. We are going to have to be making judgments. As kingdom citizens, we're going to be doing that. Now, here's the reality. Jesus wants us, our King wants us to think before we do that. That we're not just to go guns a-blazing and figure this out, but we actually think before we engage in this. So, what do you, as a kingdom citizen, as a follower of Jesus, what do we need to think about before we experience this or go through this experience of making judgments? Look with me in your Bibles today to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. Jesus says in verse 1, do not judge, unless you're talking about kale. No, I'm sorry. Do not judge so that you won't be judged. For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others, and you will be measured by the same measure you use. Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. Jesus is giving us some instruction that help answer that question. Before judgments are made, before I make them, before you make them, what are some things that I need to think? And the first is this. The experience of judgment It is a reciprocal experience. Judgment is a reciprocal experience. What does that mean? It means that you do it and you receive it. Reciprocal. It's two-way. All right, so before going further into and about this passage, let's clear the air about something. This particular passage is one that is often quoted. In fact, it is likely that this may be among the most, if not the most quoted verse in the Bible in the United States. And while I say it may be the most quoted, more accurately, it may be that it's the most misquoted, in the sense that the entire verse is not quoted. Because what regularly is cited is the beginning of verse 1, where Jesus says, "Do not judge." Now, you see in the CSB there's a comma after. Most often when people in our culture reference this verse, they will begin a statement like this. Doesn't the Bible say, didn't Jesus say, Christians aren't, or something along that, prefacing their statement, the Bible says, "Do not judge." Jesus says, "Do not judge." And you could say, in fact, maybe your Bible is a red letter edition. And if yours is a red letter edition, that says Jesus is talking. And Jesus says, "Do not judge." But the thing is, that's not all that Jesus says. Because there's not a period there. There's a comma. Jesus does not say, "Do not judge." And we're going to fully unpack that more fully in just a moment. But he says, "Do not judge so that you won't be judged." This passage doesn't communicate, and beyond that, the New Testament does not communicate that as followers of Christ, we are not to pass judgments. In fact, as followers of Jesus, as kingdom citizens, it is incumbent upon us to pass a whole slew of different judgments. For example, just even in this chapter, in verse 15, Jesus warns against false prophets. Let me ask you this. If he's warning against false prophets, how in the world are you going to identify them unless you pass a judgment? Identifying a false prophet requires a judgment. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul tells the Corinthian church that there is a promiscuous man. In fact, he says that he's having an incestuous relationship with his own mother. And he says, "I want you to hand this one over to Satan. I want you to put him out of the church." How in the world can they do that absent doing what? Passing a judgment. In Galatians 1, Paul says, "Let him be accursed, those who preach a gospel other than the true one." How in the world can you do that unless you pass a judgment? In the pastoral epistles, Paul gives criteria after criteria describing the qualifications for those that serve as a deacon, as a pastor, as an elder, as an overseer. All of these qualifications are given. On what basis would qualifications be given unless you use those qualifications to pass a judgment? In 1 John chapter 4, John calls us not to believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. What does that require? It requires judgment. I mean, throughout the whole of the New Testament, there are judgments that are incumbent on us as followers of Christ, as kingdom citizens, that we are to make. So it cannot be that Jesus is saying, "Do not judge." So what exactly is it that he's saying? He says, "Don't judge so that you won't be judged." For Verse 2, he says, "You will be judged by the same standard with which you judge." Jesus is setting out in the Sermon on the Mount some behaviors and thoughts and a whole series of norms that are the standards by which it is that we are to operate. These are the boundaries that he wants me, that he wants you as a kingdom citizen. These are the lines of operation that I'm supposed to live my life within. And so as I am living my life, I am to see that with respect to marriage, that not only is this act, but even this thought, that is out of bounds. But not only am I to see that for myself, but as I am engaging others, I am also to communicate to others and to share with them God's truth that behavior is out of bounds. What I believe that Jesus is communicating that we need to do is to draw a distinction between passing judgments and having a judgmental attitude. By that I mean this. Everyone is passing judgments because the passing of judgment is an assessment of a moral standard. It is saying that something is right and something is wrong, and everyone is doing that. In fact, when our culture tells us it's wrong to pass judgment, that's a moral assessment. They're passing a judgment by saying that. Everyone is passing these judgments. We are going to be doing that. As kingdom citizens, we need to make sure that the judgments that we pass, the judgments that we make, are not conjecture, that they are not opinion-based, that they are not merely rooted in tradition. Rather, it is that they are rooted in standards that God has erected, and that they are not rooted in this notion that I am better than someone. It is not me looking down my nose at someone with a haughty, judgmental attitude. Rather, it is me saying, all right, this is a barrier, this is a rule, this is a boundary that God has put up, and He's put it up for my good. He's put it up for your good. And I'm going to say this is what God has erected. But as I do that, Jesus says in verse 2, you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others. What does that mean? He's saying that this whole experience of judgment, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. It doesn't occur in isolation, that it is something that is absolutely reciprocal. When I was in seminary, one of the classes that I had to take was sermon delivery. I had to take one course of sermon preparation, another one of sermon delivery. And in the delivery class, there were probably, 35, 40 guys in there. And in that class, there was some preaching that you had to do outside of class, but there was some preaching you had to do inside of class as well. And all the messages that you had to do, there was a pattern that you had to follow. And all the sermons, you would have loved this, every sermon had to be no more than 10 minutes. You're laughing. Why? Anyway, so you had to preach 10 minutes, you had to preach without notes. And there's this pattern that you're following. So you've got a classroom of other preachers, and you've got this preaching professor that's in there as well. And I'm not going to lie, that will make you nervous. It just will. The other thing, I'll say this truthfully as well. Preachers are very critical of other preachers. They just are. And maybe others aren't. I'm very critical listening to other preaching. I just am. And I guess everybody is this way. If you are a plumber, you're going to be critical of others' plumbing. If you are a seamstress, you're going to be critical of others' sewing. If you are a chef, you'll be critical of the cooking. Just whatever you kind of specialize in, you're going to be more critical of someone else. And so you just kind of listen in different ways. So you know that going into this. And so here it is, everybody's sitting there, and you're preaching to people that have essentially a grading sheet in front of them, and there's all these criteria that they're looking for. And so there's all these boxes that people are literally rating you on. I know you're like, give me one of them sheets. Minus. Anyway. So it's unnerving. It's unnerving. And I knew going into this how critically it is that we can listen to each other. And I was not one of the first people that had to preach in class. And I didn't know how exactly this was going to unfold. So a guy preaches a sermon in class, and everybody's filled out one of these sheets. And after they finished, then they get to pick the message apart. You know what I was amazed by? People were so nice. I mean, they could have gone guns a-blazing. In fact, sometimes they should have gone guns a-blazing, because there were some stinkers in there. There really were. But I was amazed just how nice the people. Now the professor, not so nice, but the students, they were particularly kind to each other. You know why? Well, you know why. Because if you shot at somebody, well, then you were going to have to get up there, and they might do the same for you. And so you knew the manner in which you assessed them, they were going to assess you. Listen, it is that same thought that Jesus is communicating here. There is not a prohibition against the citizens of God's kingdom passing judgment. What he is saying and reminding us is this: you're going to be doing this. But do not think that you're in some old western where you're hiding behind a rock with a pea shooter and they can't shoot back. Because when you say you're not doing X, or that's wrong, or that's not right, do you know what they're going to be looking at? Or you know what they're going to be doing? They're going to be assessing you. And they're going to be assessing you by that same standard. And so before you ever open your mouth, before you ever say, listen, I want you to pay attention, or that's not right, or that's wrong, before you ever say something, Jesus says, I want you to think. And if you don't want anybody to say something about you, don't you say anything about them. Just keep your mouth shut. So think before you act. You're going to be passing judgments, though. So understand before you do this, judgment is a reciprocal experience. What judgment you hold others to, that same standard they're going to be expecting to find in you. Otherwise, if they don't see it, what's the word that Jesus uses for you? It's hypocrite. You're calling others to a standard that you won't maintain yourself. So before you ever engage in this, Jesus says, remember that judgment is a reciprocal experience. There's something else that you've got to think, and that's this. Judgment should be motivated by positive goals. Judgment should be motivated by positive goals. Starting in verse 5, Jesus says, and he gives a directive. He says, first, take the beam of wood out of your eye. So the fact that he's giving an ordered step, when he says, first, take the beam out of your eye. Well, that's kind of strange talk. So what exactly is he referencing there? Well, he's using an illustration. And it's an illustration that begins back in verse 3. And he says back in verse 3, he says, why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? So he's comparing two different sizes of wood. And so he's saying that you're noticing a splinter or a speck of wood in somebody else's eye, but by comparison, in your own eye, there is a beam. And the word that's used there is beam, literally means that. It's the same word used to describe like a rafter in a structure. It'd be like one of these gigantic beams that's holding up this enormous roof. So Jesus says, you're noticing a little tiny splinter in somebody else's eye, but you've got this big hunkin' beam hanging out of your eye. So you're walking around saying, hey, let me help you with that. And so Jesus says, well, there's a problem. Don't do that. He says, first, take the beam of wood out of your own eye. What's that a call to? Well, it's a call to self-examination. Jesus is saying, listen, I want you to first look in the mirror. And before you ever begin a conversation where you're calling someone else to task, before you ever seek to call someone else to evaluate themselves against the standard that God has called us to, first evaluate where you stand against those. And make sure that you're in bounds. And if you're not, fix it. Fix it. Now, here's the thing. What you could do is to say, well, I've screwed up. I've made a mistake. I'm not perfect. And so because this is part of my past, I can never say anything. Because I'm a screw-up. Listen, we all are. Let me ask you this. You go to a doctor, you go to a physician, do you think your doctor has ever been sick? You go to an orthopedist to mend a bone, do you think that orthopedist has ever had an accident where he or she broke a bone? Had a joint replacement? Made some sort of mistake? Listen, Just because an individual has a mistake, a failure, a break in the past does not preclude their ability to identify a problem in the present or in the future. What is of concern is whether it's still there or not. So that's why Jesus says, first, make sure you get this out of your life. Get this behind you. Get this beam. Get this failure. Get this misgiving. Get this out of your life. You don't need to hide it. Own it. Say, hey, in fact, if you're beginning a conversation with somebody, say, listen, this is part of my story. This is who I was. This what used to be part of my life, and I'm not proud of it. I'm not celebrating it. This was part of my life, and it was harmful to me. It was damaging to me, and God convicted me of this, and I'm a changed person, and I'm coming to you because I realize that this, in this fashion, it's also bringing harm and hurt to you, and that's why I'm now coming to you. So get this out of your life, and then he says to go to someone else. So he says, first take this beam of wood out of your eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. I don't know about you, but I don't like splinters. Splinters stink. And we're all prone, if you ever do anything, you're prone to get one occasionally. And I guess you tend to get more splinters, at least as a kid. And I really hated getting splinters as a kid when my grandfather was around, my mom's dad. And that grandfather I was particularly close to, and we spent a lot of time with that set of grandparents. And he was a carpenter by trade all of his life, and I suppose had more splinters throughout all that time than I could begin to count. And maybe because of all that, my mom assumed that he was a splinter expert. I don't know, but I always hated getting a splinter when he was around, because if I got one, she would say, go see your papa and he'll help you get it out. And so you'd go, she'd make you go to him, and I didn't want to. Because the first thing that he would do was get his glasses out so he could see it. The next thing he would do is get his pocket knife out. I'd hated to see the knife come out. And I'm like, well, where are the tweezers? Not tweezers? No, it's because that's what he had. And he'd start rooting around, and truth be told, it never really hurt that much, but it just seemed like the blade on his knife looked like, remember Crocodile Dundee's knife? It just seemed like he was using a machete or something like that to just dig around in my finger, especially if it was up under a nail or something. It was just terrible. And I think we're all prone to this, though. You can do something, like in your hand, but if somebody else does it, it's worse. And so the least little thing that he would, or you start crying or whatever. And so repeatedly, like my mom would say things like, just sit still. He's trying to help you. He's trying to help you. He's trying to help you. And that was the truth. My grandfather did not relish sitting there whittling on my thumb with his pocket knife. The aim was not to carve his initials into my hand. The aim was to get the splinter out. Pay attention to what Jesus says. He says, get the beam out of your eye so that what? Then you can get the splinter out of your brother's eye. I don't want a splinter in my finger. I don't want a splinter in my arm. I don't want a splinter in my hand. But I'm telling you, I really don't want a splinter in my eye. Splinters don't feel good. Splinters left unattended can become problematic. Splinters left unattended can become infectious. They need to come out. Jesus says, don't just sit back because you've had a failure, because you've had a beam that needed to be dealt with. He says, deal with it, your problem. Get beyond that, and then you can see clearly to go and then help your brother with their splinter. This is telling us that the experience of judgment is to be motivated by a positive goal. And what is the positive goal? To actually help. To actually help somebody. Listen, so many times we just lose sight of the fact that when God gave standards, when He gave rules for us, whether it was back in the days of Moses or it was when He raised the bar with kingdom standards in the Sermon on the Mount, He didn't do this because He wanted to make life unnecessarily difficult. It's not because He wanted to just tighten the screws on us and make us miserable. It's because He who made us with plan, purpose, and intent knows how things are supposed to work. And He knows what is actually good for us, and He knows what's actually harmful for us. And so that's why He says, listen, if you will operate between these boundaries, then this is where blessing can occur. And outside of these lines, outside of these boundaries, this is where harm and damage can occur. And our motivation in showing somebody where the boundaries are shouldn't be so that we can look down our nose at them, to wag our finger at them, to feel superior to them. It ought to be so that we can say, here, let me help you. You've got a splinter in your eye. And left unattended, you're going to lose sight. It's going to harm you. It's not to feel superior. It's not to win an argument. It's because God's truth is for our good. It's for all of our good. We're going to pass judgments. We just are. He doesn't want us to just go off and do it. He wants us to think before we act. Will you bow your heads with me?